What's up, guys? Welcome to our YouTube video about the women's rights movement. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get started. Before the women's rights movement began, women faced many challenges in society. Women had very few legal rights, which meant they could not vote, own property after marriage, or have control over their own money. Society also had strict expectations for women, and they were expected to stay at home, take care of children, and not participate in political or careers like men did. During this time, Enlightenment ideas encouraged people to think about equality and individual rights, which inspired more women to question their roles in society. Later, the Industrial Revolution created new opportunities, allowing women to work outside of their homes and become more aware of inequality. Susan B. Anthony was born into a Quaker family that strongly believed in equality for all people. She worked as a teacher before becoming a full-time activist, and early in her life she supported the abolition of slavery. Seeing unfair treatment toward women inspired her to join the movement and devote her life to fighting for it. One of her biggest goals was to win women the right to vote because she believed women deserved a voice in government. She also worked for equal legal rights for women, including the ability to own property, sign contracts, and keep the money they earned. Another major goal was to pass a constitutional amendment that would guarantee women's voting across the entire country. In addition to this, she also fought for equality for all people. She dedicated her life to creating equal rights and opportunities, which later then paved the way for the 19th Amendment, which I'll talk about a little bit later. One method that she used was public speaking and lectures. She would travel all around the U.S. giving speeches to spread awareness and convince people that women deserved equal rights. She also organized conventions and meetings, which brought supporters together. Another method she used was publishing articles in newspapers. She co-founded a newspaper called The Revolution to share ideas about women's equality and encourage others to join the cause. She also created petitions and campaigns collecting signatures and working to convince lawmakers to support women's right to vote. Finally, she would use civil disobedience to make bold statements. She would intentionally vote in the 1872 election, even though it was illegal for women to vote at the time, to try and make a strike. She was successful in bringing major attention to women's rights, and she made big progress for women's equality, but she did not live to see the final victory of women gaining the right to vote. Her work directly led to the 19th Amendment being passed in 1920, which was 14 years after her death. The amendment is often referred to as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. The movement was closely connected to the abolitionist movement. Both movements were based on the belief that all people should be treated equally and have the same rights. Many early women's rights leaders, including Susan B. Anthony, first were workers as abolitionists, fighting to end slavery. While working in the abolition movement, women began to notice that they were not treated equally, even among reformers, which inspired them to speak up for their own rights. Abolitionists and women's rights activists often supported one another. For example, Frederick Douglass was a strong supporter of women's suffrage and spoke at the Seneca Falls Convention. Today, I'll be talking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the earliest and most influential leaders in the fight for women's rights. Stanton was born in 1815 in New York, and she became an early advocate for women's equality at the time when women had very few legal or social rights. In 1848, she helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first women's rights convention in the United States. At that event, she co-authored the Declaration of Sentiments, a powerful document that demanded equal rights for women, including the right to vote. Stanton also partnered with Susan B. Anthony, and together they became leading figures in the women's suffrage movement, working tirelessly to gain voting rights for women. Her biggest contribution was providing the intellectual foundation for women's equality. She wasn't just an advocate, but also a thinker who helped shape the movement's ideas.
Next, I'll be talking about the Seneca Falls Convention, which was a major turning point in the history of the women's rights movement in the United States. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in the United States. It took place in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. It was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a strong advocate for women's equality, like I mentioned before. They wanted to create a space where people could openly discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. The convention was groundbreaking. Over 300 people attended, including both men and women. One notable supporter was Frederick Douglass, a famous abolitionist who strongly backed women's right to vote. At the convention, Stanton presented the Declaration of Sentiment, a document modeled after the Declaration of Independence, which demanded equal rights for women, including the right to vote. Overall, the Seneca Falls Convention marked the beginning of the organized women's rights movement in the United States and laid foundations for decades of activism to come. I would like to build on that Declaration of Sentiment. It was one of the most important documents, if not the most important document, in the history of women's rights. It was written mainly by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and presented at the Seneca Falls Convention. Stanton modeled it after the Declaration of Independence, like I said before, to make it more of a powerful statement, just as the colonists did when they declared independence from British rule. Women were sort of declaring their independence from unfair control of men. The document listed 18 grievances or complaints about how women were treated unequally in society. For example, being denied the right to vote, like I've said many times, to own property, or to receive equal education or employment opportunities. It also called for major reforms, including women's suffrage, property rights, and equality in education and workplace. Overall, the Declaration of Sentiment became the foundation of the women's rights movement, clearly outlining the goals and values that activists would continue to fight for in the decades that followed. Thank you guys for watching. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and we'll see you in the next one.